Nestled at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, Winnipeg, Manitoba is famous for its harsh climate. Yet, since the early 19th century, a steady stream of immigrants have made Winnipeg their home. The pioneers of old Europe have been followed by newcomers from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And one of those immigrants decided to make his living by becoming a serial killer. It all starts September 11th, 1990. The lifeless body of 27-year-old Bibi Khan is discovered in a large freezer.
She was found by Mohammed Khan, her brother, and he called emergency services. The emergency services people, the fire department, first responders, and that, called police because she was obviously deceased at the scene. So I was in right on the ground floor.
In order to establish the facts, Sergeant Gary Foster of the Homicide Squad interviews the first responders, a few neighbors, and of course, Mohammed Khan. One question that intrigues investigators is, what prevented Bibi from opening the lid?
No lock, and it's just a basic freezer that you lift up the door. It's got the little air seal on it. Apparently, when the responders got there, the interior of the freezer was hot and humid because of the body going in and radiating all the heat from the body. Once she was removed from the freezer, we could see where there had been some fresh caulking applied, which would ostensibly seal up any leaks that there were.
Bibi Khan immigrated from Guyana to Canada in 1986 on an invitation from her older brother, Mohammed. He settled in Canada a few years earlier. They now share a house on Alfred Street. Several factors make the death of Bibi Khan suspicious to the police.
She had apparently been in a car accident and had some back issues, which would, be suspicious as to why she would curl up and get into that freezer to start with, but that was his explanation.
Another question raised by the investigators is whether something could have incapacitated the victim, perhaps chemical fumes from the caulking gun.
Silicone that has a very unpleasant odor. As for the toxicity of it all, I don't know. I don't believe that other than being unpleasant, I don't believe that smelling caulking compound is fatal.
Investigators now consider Bibi's death to be suspicious. Mohammed Khan becomes the prime suspect. They easily obtain a search warrant for the house.
He was not allowed in the house for several days while our investigations went on. And like I say, we went through every vial and every bottle and every tube and of all the things that people have in their house, for repairs and any hobbies they may have.
The police find nothing that could explain why Bibi couldn't lift the freezer door. The autopsy concludes that she died of asphyxiation from an undetermined cause. The toxicology report shows less than therapeutic levels of many different drugs in the biological samples.
With Bibi's death, he looked at it that, well, there's drugs in her system, so she would have been drowsy. She had so many prescriptions that the College of Physicians and Surgeons here in Manitoba looked into her own doctor's prescribing methods. He also made mention that, well, but you have to look at the freezer, and she's in a fetal position, that she couldn't have put herself in that. She was placed there.
The autopsy report doesn't yield any solid evidence as to how and why Bibi died. Searching for more clues, investigators delve into Mohammed Khan's past. They discover some troubling information.
He was divorced, and we'd also found out that he'd been charged with bigamy, and when he was in another part of the country, for a marriage out of a convenience marriage, with dealing with immigration matters.
Certain documents seized at his home are of particular interest.
There's life insurance. He moved the mortgage on the house into her name, and she got a mortgage and buys the house from him, so he gets a whack of dough out of that. The insurance was put on her. And during the investigation, it came clear that he didn't pay bills, didn't pay a water bill, didn't pay a tax bill, and the only time that his bills were up to date was when the city welfare stepped in because Bibi was apparently on welfare.
His gas, natural gas to the home had been shut off, and the home was being heated by about 8 baseboard heaters, electric baseboard heaters. And his gas hot water tank had also been replumbed to accommodate an electric hot water tank beside it so that he could have hot water. In the basement, the house was quite cool when we were there, and there was an electric hairdryer rigged up to keep the plumbing pipes from freezing in the basement.
But the only bills that were always paid on time was his insurance policies. His premiums on insurance were always paid, and those are the only bills in his life that he appeared to pay. So there was insurance, and it was plain to us that he was using her as a bit of a cash cow.
Mohammed Khan is the beneficiary of more than $250,000 worth of insurance policies on Bibi Khan's life. In her will, Bibi describes the extent of her gratitude toward her brother. She makes Mohammed the heir to all her possessions. She explains, "He is responsible for my coming to Canada. He helped me with my studies and my needs. This is why I want to thank him this way."
We investigated this for a long time, and it was some years later in a meeting, about 14 months later, I guess, in a meeting with the chief medical examiner where we were at a loss for evidence. Yeah, it's a suspicious death. We didn't like to close the file, but we didn't have any evidence against him. So, there you go. I mean, Canadian justice is based on evidence, and we didn't have any.
With regret, Sergeant Foster is forced to close the file. After the case is closed, Mohammed Khan tries to claim the benefits from Bibi's life insurance policies. But both companies refuse to pay. They claim that the death of Bibi is suicide. Khan threatens to sue them. Two years after Bibi Khan's death, the insurance companies agree to a settlement. Mohammed Khan receives 55% of the benefits from the two policies for a total amount of $137,000. 3 years have passed, and plenty of water has flowed under the bridges of Winnipeg. Then suddenly, the past makes a surprising return. Why are the police called back to the Khan house? On September 11, 1990, Mohammed Khan finds the dead body of his sister Bibi in their freezer. The autopsy reveals that she died by asphyxiation without any identifiable cause. Her death remains a mystery. For more than a year, Gary Foster and his homicide team look for evidence to charge Mohammed Khan with murder, but they only find circumstantial evidence. Mohammed Khan settles the insurance claim on his sister's life and pockets more than $130,000. On the night of December 26, 1993, police once again are called to Mohammed Khan's home at his request. This is the second time in 3 years that police visit Khan's house.
Computer system of the day, as soon as you put in an address, all the events, previous events at that address would have come flowing up, complete with report numbers and all that. And everybody who went there should have been briefed on, this was a scene of a suspicious death X amount of months or years ago. And, just beware of that.
He says he was out with his wife and that she left early to go home, that she must have had trouble unlocking the door, and she is not to be found when he comes home. So he's worried about her and he asked for help regarding basically a missing person.
The missing woman is Mohammed's 21-year-old wife, Sarita Khan. They met during one of his trips to Guyana and have been married for over 2 years.
And police are quick to search the home as well as his yard, including a van parked rear of the lot, and they find Sarita Khan inside the van suffering from hypothermia. And in fact, she has some serious frozen tissue, I believe, and damage to her right foot. This is, again, late December in Winnipeg. Temperatures of 25, 30 below are not uncommon. If she's unable to unlock the door of her home to go inside, one would wonder why you would go to the vehicle, especially if you don't have vehicle keys to start it.
It doesn't seem logical that Sarita would curl up and fall asleep in their van at minus 25 degrees Celsius. Dr. Gordon Giesbrecht studies the effect of hypothermia on the human body.
Well, actually, our bodies are big chunks of meat that really defend temperature well. It takes a lot of energy just to cool, the mass that we have, and we also start shivering, which increases our heat production. That's why it takes so long to become hypothermic. And in cold air, it could take, several hours. So falling asleep in the middle of that in a person without drugs or alcohol is highly unlikely, because it is very, very painful.
Signs of frostbite are obvious on Sarita Khan's foot, but it's unclear how she became unconscious. Sarita is taken to hospital for treatment and released the following day. As part of her recovery, she is told to rest, stay warm, and keep the blisters on her foot clean.
If they were doing the right post-trauma treatment, they'd have been putting her feet minimum once a day, if not 2 or 3 times a day, in a warm whirlpool bath. That is a clearly accepted follow-up treatment for frostbite. Commonly, there are blisters that form on the tissue. So not only do you want to keep it warm and not frozen again, but once you have blisters, sterility it becomes an issue because you don't want to infect, a blister area if it happens to break. And if you were going to be doing the warm water bath, you would take the bandages off, do the warm water bath, and then dry, and then rebandage the area.
On January 4th, just over a week since the missing person incident, the Winnipeg police are called for the 3rd time to the Khan residence.
A young woman was found initially by her husband in a bathtub and allegedly had drowned. Mohammed Khan, the husband of the deceased, had pulled the plug on the bathtub during a 911 conversation, and the operator was asking him, of course, to do CPR. Winnipeg ambulance had been contacted and had arrived to attempt resuscitation to the body, and unfortunately, these efforts failed.
The young woman in the bathtub is none other than Sarita Khan.
Those circumstances were very suspicious, and the BB Khan investigation, then Sarita's disappearance and recovery in a van, all led investigators to have red flags.
Mohammed Khan is quick to explain to the police how he discovered his wife.
Mohammed was elsewhere. He was at a friend's place, and his wife called him and was saying that, "I'm feeling itchy." And Mohammed told her that, well, take a bath, and repeatedly said, take a bath and then go to bed. You'll feel better. And so he continued doing some errands, and when he got home, she was in the bathtub, but she was underwater. And he called police. Everybody rushed there.
Apparently, everything indicates that the young woman drowned. According to the report from the rescue team, the victim's body was wet when they arrived.
Police told him that, your wife's dead, and he expressed at first He expressed disbelief, but he wasn't emotional. He basically just said, well, how could she be dead? Because the water's still warm.
Khan's question is very intriguing.
The body was cooling already, yet it had rigor mortis, the stiffening of the muscles after death, so that they could not intubate the person. So if I look at the various points that give me this opinion, she's been dead a while, and probably 2, maybe as much as 4 hours, sometime in that. Typically, the stiffening of the jaw that prevents putting the breathing tube in takes place in around 2 to 4 hours in temperate conditions.
Khan's comment directly contradicts the evidence noted by the rescue team, not to mention that bathtub drownings are very rare.
So usually the people that die in the bathtub or the shower have some major underlying natural disease that is prone to make them suddenly and unexpectedly not be able to protect themselves. So they've got heart disease, or they have a seizure, or they've impaired themselves with drug or toxins. The natural deaths who happen to die in a tub, they usually don't drown. They have their cardiac event and they just happen to be in the water when they die.
Carrie Armitt, a specialist in forensic identification, examines the state of the bathroom carefully.
Well, it suggested that the scene had been staged. And there was also a towel rack on a glass sliding door that surrounds the tub that had been broken off, and a part of that towel rack was inside the tub. We also noticed that there was a woman's nightie on the floor in the bathroom. However, no towel could be found in the bathroom. We found this odd as well. She may have been in the bathtub, however, it was doubtful that somebody had taken a bath, because in my experience, there's usually water in the tub or the drain area for some hours after. And it appeared very dry. There was no water residue at all in the tub.
Suspicious of Mohammed Khan's history and the contradicting evidence in the bathroom, the police look around the house.
Then I remember searching, more of a cursory search of other rooms in the house at that time. We certainly didn't go top to bottom and seize all of our exhibits at that evening. We looked at the position of clothing and just the general layout of the home and the furniture, and was there any evidence of an apparent struggle in the home, for example. All these types of things were looked at. And then ultimately, in an office area, a couple of insurance policies were found, along with papers describing how to use plants for poisons, for example. Various things like that were of interest to us.
In fact, one of the questions they asked is, did you have an insurance policy on your wife's life? And that's when he started getting pretty defensive and basically said, that's none of your business. That's probably more than anything one of the things that put a big question mark with the police and started the whole chain of events to let's investigate this further.
There is enough evidence for police to justify a request for a warrant to do an in-depth search. Mohammed Khan is escorted from the house and is not allowed to return until the investigation is complete.
And I was on a hunting trip up in north central Manitoba, and I was watching the news, and this news story came on. The address, a dead woman found at this address, and I perked up and said, gee, I know that address. And then they mentioned the name, Khan, and I said, okay, this stinks already, suspicious already. And I phoned my bosses and cut my hunting trip short by a few days and headed back into Winnipeg to get involved in this investigation.
Sergeant Foster, who led the investigation into the death of Bibi Khan, is also assigned to this case.
I was briefed on the fact that Sarita Singh Khan was found dead in a bathtub. She had this was a winter in Winnipeg, and she'd spent a night in a van because she couldn't get into the house for one reason or another.
Investigators strongly suspect that Mohammed Khan has murdered his wife.
Everybody would have suspected it, but you can't act on your suspicions in this country, so you have to wait for the evidence.
Is Mohammed Khan a man tragically struck by fate? Or is he a cold and calculating serial killer with a deceptive ability to cover his tracks? Mohammed Khan's sister and wife are both found dead in his house 3 years apart. Investigators suspect the 38-year-old Guyanese immigrant is responsible. The parallels between the two cases are uncanny. Two young Guyanese women, isolated and vulnerable, two suspicious deaths, and two sets of life insurance policies. Sarita Khan's autopsy begins on January 5, 1994, at the Center for Health Sciences in Winnipeg. The forensic pathologist is Dr. Kelly McDonald.
First of all, I would say that I don't approach a scene with the assumption that this is a homicide. It's a suspicious death, a death of interest, but homicide is a ruling that the court makes or that the medical examiner assigns to it. But if there's a death which may not be natural, the more information I have about the person's previous health, their habits, their lifestyle choices, whether they're drug or alcohol problems, when they were last seen alive, when they appeared well, where they were, it's really helpful.
The preliminary examination is complete. Now the pathologist can begin the autopsy.
She was kind of like a tiny, perfect woman. She only weighed 35 kilograms, less than 80 pounds. She was almost exactly 5 feet tall, but she was not malnourished. We will keep track of all the clothings or articles of property that came with the body, photograph all surfaces, with and without scales, so you can place whatever injuries or findings. We'll seize various specimens from the body, samples of head hair, samples of body hair. We'll look at the fingernails, clip and or scrape the fingernails. In a forensic examination, as opposed to an examination on an in-hospital death, most of your useful information, if it's going to be a death from violence, you're going to find on the surface of the body.
Due to Mohammed Khan's history with dead and missing women, a thorough selection of samples and body fluids are taken from the victim. Dr. McDonald also notes that the victim's skin is perfectly smooth, which contradicts the hypothesis of extended exposure to water in the bathtub.
If she was 2 hours in water, she would be good and pruny. I have no evidence of that. If she was in hot water, not only would she be pruny, but the skin would start to strip, deglove, so the skin of the hands, particularly the palms and the feet, would start to come off. The hair loosens, so you can remove it more easily. It starts to fall out. And if it was hot water, it would warm up the tissues underneath of it to semi-cook them, so it would look like rare steak or slightly cooked ham. None of that was there. So I have no reason to believe she had a prolonged cold water immersion. I have no reason to believe she's had a short hot water immersion. She didn't die in that tub.
But if the victim did not die in the bathtub, what caused her death? Kelly McDonald is aware that Sarita was found frostbitten and hypothermic on December 26. He takes that into consideration so it does not confuse his findings. The signs of frostbite are still obvious, and there are still deep blisters on one foot. But these are not the only marks he finds on Sarita's skin.
This young woman had few petechiae. They were on the mucous membranes of one eye. They were in the nose. They were a little bit on the anterior surface, the front surface of the lungs. They couldn't possibly have been from the frostbite or hypothermic episode the 7 or 8 days ago, because they would have healed. They're tiny. They're pinhead-sized type things. So these were clearly around the time of death. They're commonly found in asphyxial type deaths, deaths where there's compression of the neck or compression of the chest, such that we restrict airflow and blood flow within the body. So the significance of the finding depends on the circumstances and the history, not on just that you've got petechiae.
Following the external examination, MacDonald proceeds to the internal exam.
The stomach contents were of great interest to me as the investigation. If somebody drowns, one of the things that they may do, not always, but may, is that they will gasp and swallow water during the course of the drowning. So to look to see if the person has watery gastric contents allows you to put a check mark on the positive finding rather than a check mark on the negative finding column. And so her entire gastric contents were saved and examined, and it was just a dry rice curry. It was not watery at all. It was undigested, thick. You could identify almost every rice grain. It was all saved, and it was all went to toxicology. I had no evidence that there was water in the stomach.
Kelly MacDonald's initial findings exclude drowning and suggest an intentional asphyxiation. The autopsy alone doesn't allow him to make a definite assessment as to the cause of death. MacDonald must wait for the toxicology report to make his conclusions. Will the results of the toxicology tip the balance? Investigators are about to make a second and more detailed search of Mohammed Khan's house. Will they find a direct piece of evidence that will link Khan to the murder of his wife? Winnipeg police suspect Mohammed Khan has murdered his wife, Sarita Khan. Nearly 3 years earlier, he was a suspect in the death of his sister, Bibi Khan. But with a lack of evidence, investigators were forced to close the file. On January 25th, Dr. MacDonald receives the toxicology report.
This woman showed traces of all sorts of drug at very low levels. And some of them are relatively common drug, like she had an antihistamine on board, a variety of sleeping aids that you can buy over the counter. So in addition to that, the woman had at least 2 opiates, narcotics, common over-the-counter narcotic available in Canada, codeine, and they had a more potent prescription narcotic which goes under the name of Demerol on board. Again, not huge doses, a little bit less than therapeutic, but 2 narcotics and an antihistamine, all of which are sedating, and they potentiate each other so that the amount of sleepiness this woman may have had may not have been twice because she had 2 drugs. It might have been 3 or 4 times or multiples of what she would have had if she had any one of them. There was also a peculiar and complicating factor, which is that they identified a volatile organic compound called chloroform. Now, people may know chloroform because it was long ago used as an anesthetic agent.
Dr. MacDonald writes his report after meeting with the chief medical examiner.
With the opinion and advice of the chief medical examiner, Dr. Markestein, we attributed causes of death as asphyxiation. And there are many ways that somebody can be asphyxiated. And because of the interest with this chloroform as a contributing but not causal factor, he was advised for me to put in chloroform effect. It was just that asphyxial deaths can be subtle and missed, and it would fit with how to gently kill an intoxicated, tiny woman and leave almost no traces. My opinion that it was a moved body was that I can't square rigor and no skin or tissue changes of prolonged immersion in either cold or hot water.
The conclusion of the pathologist supports the suspicions of the investigators and the prosecutor. Police suspect that Mohammed Khan may have used chloroform to sedate his victims.
In our belief, he's the one that asphyxiated her with an external force and put her in the bathtub.
The coroner then requests that the investigators return to Mohammed Khan's house and look for evidence to support the toxicology results.
They wanted to collect every little bit of evidence they could possibly find that they believed at that point in time, yeah, we're dealing with not just one homicide, we're probably dealing with 2 homicides, the one from 3 years before.
Investigators look for 2 vital pieces of evidence: chloroform and insurance policies. The 5-day search is extremely thorough.
There were some needles and syringes found. I don't believe that Mr. Khan or his wife were diabetics or had any medical need for those needles and syringes, so perhaps there was some drug abuse. So any unknown powders and liquids were seized, and the number of exhibits became huge. There were a number of prescription drug vials throughout the home, including the basement and Mr. Khan's van parked outside. Some of these vials had some pills in them, and some were empty. And there were a number of non-prescription drugs in the home as well. All of them were seized.
The police discover an unexpected and revealing document.
On a end table in the living room were some papers which contained handwritings entitled "The 12 Steps to Commit the Perfect Murder," which we found extremely interesting. And of course, handwriting analysis was done with known samples of Mr. Khan's writing and this particular handwritten material to show that, in fact, Mr. Khan could have wrote this 12 steps to commit the perfect murder. A couple of the 12 steps to commit the perfect murder were, for example, find a gullible girl, convince her that you're a terrific guy, entice her by promising to have a family with her, and impress upon her the importance of having an insurance policy. During hypnosis, confirm validity of reincarnation, nothing to fear, painless death. A search of the house revealed 3 insurance policies, I believe, totaling approximately $500,000.
Apparently there was another name involved. Khan used a pseudonym, a fake name, to be the beneficiary, because the insurance company wants the beneficiaries, when there was a payout, he didn't want his name being flagged as saying, okay, I got money from BB Khan, now I'm the beneficiary on this insurance policy.
Strangely, investigators cannot find any evidence in the house to indicate that Mohammed Khan had a job to support himself. Evidence is pointing to the possibility that Khan was living off the benefits from the life insurance policies.
So his sister dies 3 years before, he gets $100,000 plus, and 3 years later that his wife suddenly dies, and there's maybe going to be another insurance payment. During that 3 years and before his sister's death, there were lots of bills that were unpaid, there were lots of bills that were late, but consistently, the only bill in that household that was paid was his insurance premiums on both women.
Police have now seized more than 1,000 pieces of evidence from Mohammed Khan's house, and they may have also uncovered a motive for murder. Will all this evidence link Mohammed Khan to the deaths of Bibi and Sarita? Suspected of murdering his sister in 1991 and his wife in 1994, Mohammed Khan is about to be arrested by the Winnipeg police. Sergeant Foster arrives at Khan's home with a warrant for his arrest.
He's not opening the door, so we leaned on the door and it sprung open, and we're yelling out that it's the police. And he's on the phone to a lawyer. He said, police, we're arresting you for 2 charges, first-degree murder of BB Khan and Sarita Singh, and you're going to be coming with us. And his lawyer was on the phone, so I briefly had a conversation with her. We exchanged, she says, you're not going to ask him any questions, he's not going to give me any statements. I says, well, giving him the statements is up to him, and our job is to ask questions, so we'll be asking questions. Took him down to our office, and there we had an interview. Now, granted, during the whole interview, he didn't say a whole heck of a lot, and just was cold and calculating, and like I said, had an arrogant attitude about him, and he was only worried that he was hungry and thirsty and wanted some water and some food. We had got from him that he wasn't about to say anything, which is definitely his right, but he still needed to know that we found traces of chloroform in Sarita's brain. And this is a large basis for our murder. And we believe that he committed the murder. And we believe that he killed Bibi as well in the same fashion.
Sarita's body has been waiting for 2 weeks to be claimed for burial. But her family in Guyana does not have the money to repatriate her. Mohammed Khan's lawyer files a request for the body to remain in Canada and be examined by independent experts. The tone is set. The suspect is far from cooperative and will fight the charges one by one. The toxicology from Sarita Khan revealed the presence of chloroform. Additional tests on the samples from Bibi Khan also revealed traces of chloroform.
The Crown's theory was that with Bibi, that she basically was, the drugs would make her drowsy, that then she had, well, they originally thought chloroform, and then she was placed in the freezer and then slammed the door shut, and she just suffocated in there.
As the Crown prosecutor is building the case against Mohammed Khan, some surprising news comes back from the forensic lab. The lab had continued to test other cadavers for chloroform, and they discovered that 80% of the corpses contained the same anesthetic.
It's got a variety of industrial uses, and it's a common contaminant in our water, in our air, and in environment. And if people look for it, they can find it in trace amounts here, there, and all over the place. I, as a pathologist, have great difficulty dealing with that because we don't have standard tables of how much do I carry, for example, right at this moment. So it gives me not information, it gives me noise that just confuses the situation.
So in a sense, what led Mohammed Khan on his legal odyssey through the courts was based on a mistake.
The prosecution drops the chloroform evidence, but with more than 1,000 other pieces of evidence, their case is still very strong. In fact, this case held the record for the largest number of exhibits in Manitoba's history. Mohammed Khan is charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Bibi Khan and Sarita Khan. The trial begins May 29, 1995. The prosecutor describes his theory of how Sarita Khan was murdered. On the afternoon of January 4th, 1990, Mohammed Khan is about to leave home. He makes sure before he leaves that Sarita has taken her medications, a cocktail of analgesics and antihistamines. Concerned about his alibi, Khan goes out shopping to carefully collect receipts indicating the date and times. He then visits a friend to complete his alibi. Sarita calls Khan at his friend's home and she complains of being itchy. He tells her to take her medication and go to bed. Around 5 p.m., Khan returns home to find Sarita in bed. She is half conscious from her cocktail of medications. Mohammed then places a pillow over his wife's face and waits. She is unable to struggle. The murder takes just a few minutes. He then drags Sarita's body to the bathroom. He places her on the floor and stages the scene to look as if he had attempted to resuscitate her from the bathtub. Around 7 p.m., he calls 911. After the prosecutor completes his plausible hypothesis, the defense presents his case to the contrary.
The defense pathologist later on in the trial said something different, that based on the amount of water that came from the woman's mouth when the paramedics came and got her out to try to revive her, he thought that, no, that is consistent with drowning was the amount. And the defense pathologists were basically saying that they believed that there was a good chance that she'd had a seizure, and that's how she died.
A disturbing fact that concerns both victims is that neither has ever complained of abuse by Mohammed Khan. The defense counsel reveals an audio recording that surprises the court.
Bibi Khan had actually recorded her own voice talking about her troubled life, how she'd been raped, how she'd been beaten, how that her family basically would force her to go get some tea, go get some cooking oil, and how will she pay for that? Well, give sex. The only person she wanted to have at her funeral was Mohammed Khan, her brother, because he was the only one in the family that treated her great. And she talked about her brother in these terms. A psychiatrist at the trial said this is a suicide letter that she was doing, but it also showed just how she had this love for the brother who was accused of killing her.
The defense claims that the petechia, or pink spots, found on Sarita's body could have been caused by the hypothermia that she suffered on December 26. The prosecution calls upon a hypothermia expert to counter that argument.
There'd be no connection between frostbite on your feet or general body hypothermia on petechiae on your face a week later. No. The only thing where you might have skin coloration issues would be in the frostbitten area.
The presence of petechia on the face proves that Sarita was suffocated. The prosecutor adds weight to the case by presenting multiple insurance policies. On each one, Mohammed Khan is named the beneficiary. The prosecutor then presents the document called 12 Steps to Commit the Perfect Murder. Handwriting analysis shows it was likely written by Mohammed Khan. This paper not only gives an idea of the thought process of the suspect, but it explicitly lists 5 victims, all women, who were killed between 1970 and 1994. The author adds that he will continue to add names to the list until he is stopped. After a long and controversial trial, the jury presents their verdict.
They said, yes, Mohammed Khan is guilty of first-degree murder in both the deaths of his wife Sarita and his sister Bibi. And first-degree murder comes with the result that it's basically it's life imprisonment, no chance of parole for 25 years. So at that moment in time, Mohammed Khan was looking at the very least, the next 25 years he was going to be in prison.
Mohammed Khan appeals the jury's decision. That begins a series of trials and appeals that last more than 5 years and makes this one of the most expensive cases in Manitoba's judicial history. Mohammed Khan's final appeal in the Sarita Khan case is denied. He now lives in Stony Mountain Penitentiary. Due to Khan's life sentence and the excessive legal cost, the Manitoba court decided not to pursue the final trial for Bibi's murder. Mohammed Khan controlled everything in his life: his sister, his wife, their lives, and their deaths. But he chose an accomplice that he could not control. Water once again betrays the criminal. It is the murders of unimaginable violence that leave an indelible mark on all who confront them. This is the case with the murder of Brigitte Grenier, a 16-year-old girl who disappeared on the night of June 23, 1990, and was found dead the next day on a country road near Rose Isle, Manitoba, lying half submerged in a stream. The story of the murder is full of unexpected twists and turns that span more than 15 years. Despite all the efforts deployed over the years, there are still doubts. Has the real culprit been punished for this terrible crime?
When I was covering the law courts for several years with the Free Press, I'd read all the transcripts of interviews and everything. I would look at the photo packs that the jury saw to see how this young woman died, to see how she was impaled by sticks. That it was the one and only time that I went back up to my office and cried, that it was just horrific what happened. Nobody should die that way.
She was found nude, horribly beaten and brutalized. The pictures are probably the worst that I've seen in all my years as defense counsel or since. I've never seen anything that horrific.
The quiet village of Rose Isle is 100 kilometers southwest of Winnipeg. Nobody ever suspected it to be the scene of such a crime.
There's a creek that runs through the area, Pumpkin Creek, and this was at I believe it was the first annual Woodstick Folk Festival the local people were putting on.
With age-appropriate range to meet each other. And it was the typical party, as I understand it. Alcohol was consumed, drugs were consumed.
Brigitte Grenier is at the festival to have a good time like everyone else.
She was a very friendly, very happy, very outgoing kid, that she was president of the high school where she went to. We never heard anything bad about her. She was just a very wonderful kid.
The discovery of Brigitte Grenier's body poses a big problem for the police. The young woman disappeared during the Woodstick Festival, which means there are nearly 300 people to question to begin the investigation. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police collect a few pieces of information that will guide the investigation while they wait for the results of the autopsy. Investigators trace Brigitte Grenier's last moments on the night of the festival. Their attention begins to focus on two young men, 17-year-old Timothy Houlihan and 19-year-old Kyle Unger. Both went to the same school as the victim. The oldest one, Kyle Unger, isn't very popular in town and is known to the police.
He was somebody that, yes, he had friends, but to a great extent he was a loner, that he probably, in a sense, from what was said at trial, he didn't fit in with everybody else.
Tim Houlihan comes from a respected family. He is the same age as the victim and in the same class.
He was very slight in stature, not very tall, looked younger than his age, probably looked about 15. Basically, he looked like the kid next door. The evidence showed that Tim met Ms. Grenier at the festival. They apparently took a liking to each other and spent a fair bit of time together during the course of the festival.
Later that evening, Brigitte and Houlihan move away from the party. They wander into the woods, away from the concert site.
Kyle was there with one of his friends, a fellow named John Beckett. I think he and Beckett were together quite a bit during the course of the evening. Kyle admitted to consuming alcohol and some drugs. I think, as I recall, Kyle announced to his friend, "I'd like to go look for some girls now, maybe to meet some girls, have some fun." And that seemed to be the tenor as the evening for Kyle was winding down of what his interests were at that particular point.
Kyle Unger's friend, who was already pretty drunk, sees him leave, but cannot say how long he is gone, maybe 20 or 30 minutes. Witnesses claim to have seen Unger at another campfire around 3:30 in the morning. Unger tells his friend that he saw Brigitte and a guy having sex in the woods. Other witnesses report seeing Houlihan around 4 a.m. He is covered in mud and blood and has scratches on his face. Unger and his friend leave the festival at around 4:30 in the morning. The investigators continue questioning witnesses from the festival. They establish that Kyle Unger was seen talking to Grenier that night. They call him in for questioning. Kyle Unger has his first interview with police. He answers all questions without hesitation. Unger says that Brigitte Grenier was a good friend.
Kyle was extremely cooperative with the police, even though he didn't have counsel present when they were first dealing with him. They asked him for a hair sample. He provided that without hesitation.
All of the witnesses say that Tim Houlihan was the last person to be seen with Brigitte Grenier, so it's not surprising that the police want to interview him next. Investigators contact Tim, and his parents immediately call their lawyer.
I was contacted by his parents. He was under the age of 18 at the time, and so I drove out to meet with Tim and his parents, and went down to the RCMP detachment in Carmen and presented him to the RCMP. At that point, because the investigation was very new, on advice of counsel, he declined to provide any comments. And he was released. He was allowed to go home. And then within a day or so, we went back to the RCMP detachment.
During his second interview, Houlihan gives a more detailed version of what happened the night of the crime. He claims that while having consensual sex with Brigitte, he was the victim of a violent attack by an unknown assailant and lost consciousness. When he woke up, Brigitte was gone. During his final interview, the police suspect that Houlihan is afraid to reveal the identity of his assailant. They ask him if he's talking about Kyle Unger, and he says yes. Houlihan then explains that he didn't lose consciousness and describes the murder in detail.
Tim told police that he and Ms. Grenier engaged in consensual sexual activity, which was interrupted when Mr. Unger came upon them and then proceeded to attack Tim and beat and kill Ms. Grenier, and then force Tim to help him move her body down by the stream.
Although Houlihan claims he was a victim, the police see him in much the same way they see Kyle Unger.
Let's say if you had the two of them in front of you and it said who committed this crime type thing, and you see someone who's fine and someone who's basically looks like they've been in a fight, they've got mud, scratches, etc. Well, it's Tim Houlihan, but when all was said and done and some two people were charged, it was both of them that were charged based on their investigation.
5 days after Brigitte's death, Kyle Unger and Tim Houlihan are both arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The rapid conclusion to the investigation raises more questions than answers.
What are the odds, in my opinion, logically, of two people who do not know each other meeting together by accident and both of them being so vicious that they would both, not knowing each other, have this common link and be capable of committing the acts that were perpetrated on Miss Grenier? How can you possibly think of that scenario unless you're writing fiction?
Brigitte Grenier's body is transported to Winnipeg, where it is prepared for autopsy. Will the pathology report help shed some light on this heinous crime? On June 24th, 1990, a horrific murder takes place in a small rural community in southwest Manitoba. While nearly 300 young people had a good time dancing and listening to rock and folk music, 16-year-old Brigitte Grenier suffered unspeakable abuse in a forest nearby. Her naked, impaled and bruised body is found half submerged in a creek. 2 days after the murder, the body of Brigitte Grenier arrives at the St. Boniface Hospital in Winnipeg.
The medical examiner's office have the task of investigating a death. We are not crime investigators, we are death investigators.
Dr. Peter Markestein is the chief medical examiner for the province. He conducts the autopsy.
We very carefully examine every little bit of the body and lift evidence if we see it. And then the body is photographed extensively and documented, as I said, for the presence of bruises or tears or cuts. The hands are examined. Then we examine orifices of the body. And routine swabs are taken, as well as the taking of hair samples, both actively and passively, either put there by the assailant, if there is an assailant, or pulled by, from the body in case they are loose and on the assailant. So it's a sort of a comparison between assailant and victim.
One of the duties of a pathologist is to determine the cause of death.
The body was found in water. And when any body is found in water, we have to try to determine whether the person drowned or whether they were dead prior to being submerged or getting submerged in water.
Certain indications tell Dr. Markestein that drowning is probably not the cause of Brigitte Grenier's death.
There was no water in the lungs at all. They were of normal weight. And they showed, even under the microscope, no evidence of inhalation of foreign material. There were bruises on the body in the form of fingerprints or marks around the throat, consistent with fingertips, which was associated by signs of possible manual strangulation. The body on the outside showed what we call a blush over the cheeks, which is seen in strangulation, and together with the finger marks. And when we looked on the inside of the body, we saw a fracture of the tongue bone, which is almost characteristic, not necessarily, but is often seen in manual strangulation. All that together was a picture of asphyxiation. And I concluded following the autopsy that asphyxiation was the cause of death, most likely due to manual force applied to the neck.
In his long career as a medical examiner, Dr. Markestein admits he has never seen such horrific atrocities committed to a body.
The body was naked and covered with mud, or dried mud at that time, by the time I did the autopsy. And the body showed signs of having been assaulted with sticks, and which was actually rather gruesome to see.
Dr. Markestein identifies two types of weapons: a type of bludgeon, possibly a 2x4 for the external blows, and smaller sticks that were used to impale the victim.
There were severe injuries sustained as a result of sticks that had been inserted into the body, and they led to bleeding inside on both sides.
There were several other notable markings found on Brigitte Grenier's body that may help identify the perpetrator.
We found 3 elliptical wounds that were patterned. In other words, they had a certain pattern to them, like a picket fence sort of pattern, which was entirely consistent with being bite marks.
A forensic odontologist is brought in to examine the bite marks. Photographs are taken in order to compare them to dental imprints from the suspects. After completing the autopsy, Dr. Markestein concludes the cause of Brigitte Grenier's death is asphyxiation. There is very little evidence that can identify a suspect. However, this information partially corroborates Houlihan's version of events. The only new evidence found during the autopsy were the bite marks. Will they lead to the identity of the attacker? On a warm June night at a music festival in rural Manitoba, a young girl is brutally murdered. After a short investigation, the police arrest 2 young men on charges of first-degree murder. Kyle Unger is held in remand while Tim Houlihan is sent to a detention center for minors. Following an autopsy, the police have bite mark evidence from the body. They ask for dental impressions from both of the accused. Unger quickly cooperates with the police.
He readily provided his teeth impressions so they could be scientifically compared to the impression on the body. Houlihan never offered up his teeth impressions.
And at that point, on the advice of counsel, he declined to do that, mainly because the investigation was in its infancy. We didn't know what we were dealing with, and I wanted to keep all of his options open. But there was no legal obligation at the time to provide those kind of biological samples, teeth impressions, blood, anything of that nature. As a result of a number of cases, that was changed, and now police can apply for a warrant and get the samples they require. You have to bear in mind as well that DNA was pretty much in its infancy still. And so it was only when DNA became very sophisticated that getting a simple blood sample was useful for DNA purposes.
The forensic odontologist has only Unger's set of dental impressions for comparison. After analysis, the report is submitted to the preliminary inquest. However, the judge finds the wording to be biased and the evidence is inadmissible. Dr. Markestein then looks for another dental expert to testify at the trial. The bite mark evidence is, for the moment, inconclusive. Tim Houlihan applies for bail while in detention.
When he was ultimately transferred to adult court, he was taken into custody because an adult indictment was preferred against him. And we made another bail application in adult court, and he was released on similar bail conditions.
Kyle Unger doesn't stay very long in remand. The first-degree murder charge against him is dropped due to a lack of evidence. After his release, the police learned that Unger had admitted to murdering Grenier to another prisoner, Jeffrey Cohen, while in remand.
He had a fairly extensive criminal record, and that he was pending at that time on many different types of charges. Well, Jeffrey Cohen, as I recall, the way he came about was the day that Kyle Unger had his charges dropped after the preliminary hearing is when Mr. Cohen claimed that he had come back to the jail cell, said, I killed her, got away with it. Cohen somehow brought his information to the attention of the authorities.
The prosecution believes that the information from Cohen, combined with Houlihan's testimony, is still not enough to justify a new trial against Unger. However, the presumption of guilt against him is strong enough for the police to try a new undercover investigative technique. The Mr. Big operation was developed by the Vancouver RCMP in the early 1990s. The operation with Kyle Unger is the first ever conducted in Manitoba.
Whether it's because it was the first one that they were able to get approvals and probably the budgets and everything, and it probably also shows just how convinced the RCMP were that Kyle Unger was part of this homicide, and they figured when he was let off there was enough evidence. Well, let's get the evidence, and the way to get the evidence is to try to get a confession from him, so let's put together a Mr. Big operation.
On June 13, 1991, nearly a year after the crime, the court authorizes the undercover unit to begin its covert investigation and intercept and record private communications from Kyle Unger.
They were RCMP officers, of course, and they were brought in from Quebec to come in and do the sting operation. Because the last thing you want to have happen is when they're trying to convince Kyle Unger to join a gang, to have somebody walk along the street and say, "Oh, hi, Sergeant somebody." That's the last thing you want.
The undercover operatives, Little Larry and Big Larry, respectively play the roles of a gangster and his boss. For a week, they focus on gaining Kyle Unger's trust. Then they make it clear that they like Unger and want him to become a part of the organization.
They would pull out bank rolls of cash that he thought was as much as $10,000, flashing a big roll when they would pay for a meal for him at a restaurant. And he started seeing big dollar signs and big money being available. Here's a kid, after the preliminary hearing ended, who couldn't get a job. Couldn't get a job because he was Kyle Unger, the guy who got off, so to speak, on the murder charge. So this was an extraordinarily tempting opportunity that had been presented to him by these sophisticated officers.
He was pretty vulnerable at the time type thing. And once again, he fell for it hook, line, and sinker.
Kyle Unger tells the undercover operatives many times that he was in prison for a crime he did not commit. On June 22, 1991, Kyle Unger meets Little Larry at Big Larry's apartment. Their goal is to get a confession from Unger.
And so what they decided to do was to have a phony Winnipeg Sun newspaper, and with a phony article in it, talking about the anniversary of her death and describing what had happened. And of course, they used that as one of their springboards to say, "Hey, Kyle, I'm just paraphrasing, you're a star. Look at this. This is what you did. You got to be happy. You got to be proud. You got to be this."
Unger is anxious to make a good impression, but they warn him it's essential to tell them the truth.
They're portraying themselves that, yeah, you can make some money through our gang activities type thing, and we'd like you to join our gang, but in order to join our gang, we have to know that you're with us, and the way that we know you're with us is if you can confess to something that you've done.
Early in the discussion, Big Larry questions Kyle Unger about the murder that he's accused of committing. He encourages Unger to give them all the details. During their conversation, Big Larry insists that Unger prove that he can be trusted. Unger, at first hesitantly, and then with more enthusiasm, confesses to the murder of Brigitte Grenier. Throughout the conversation with the undercover operatives, Unger maintains that he acted alone.
And what Kyle confessed was he murdered Brigitte Grenier, and he actually showed them basically where it was, and he showed how it was done, and it was all on tape.
Kyle Unger's description of the strangulation and impaling of the victim corresponds to the evidence gathered. But as Unger continues to describe the murder, certain details no longer match the evidence. He claims to have thrown away the sticks used to impale the victim, even though they were still inside the body at autopsy. He says the crime took place near a bridge, but the bridge was built after the murder. On June 25, 1991, Unger is arrested and, again, charged with first-degree murder. The police and the prosecutor still believe that the crime was committed by both suspects. They also arrest Tim Houlihan. The joint trial for the two accused is scheduled for January 1992. While joint trials are not very common, this one is particularly unusual. Generally, when two suspects are accused of the same crime, they blame each other. In this case, Houlihan alleges that Unger forced him to participate in the murder, while Unger claims he committed the murder alone. A last-minute request to separate the trials is denied. Will the prosecution be able to prove that the murder was committed by both Unger and Houlihan? June 1990. Two young men from a small town in rural Manitoba are arrested for the murder of Brigitte Grenier, a 16-year-old girl. The sadistic crime shocks the community, but for lack of evidence, the charges are dropped. An undercover operation provides a confession from Kyle Unger, who claims to have committed the crime alone, while Tim Houlihan confesses that Unger forced him to participate in the murder. Finally, in February 1992, the joint trial begins. The two defense lawyers face a formidable opponent, Crown Prosecutor George Dangerfield.
Well, certainly back in the mid to late 80s and into the 90s, George Dangerfield was the most prominent Crown attorney in the province of Manitoba. That if there was just a little assault, you would never see George Dangerfield there. If there was a prominent murder, George Dangerfield was always the prosecutor.
The prosecutor endorses the theory of a murder committed by two people, as presented by the investigators.
Crowns generally like to try co-accused together. There's a presumption that people who are jointly involved in a crime should be tried together. It gives certain tactical advantages to a Crown as well, because it sets both accused up for cutthroat defenses. In other words, both end up pointing the finger at the other one as the perpetrator, which is exactly what happened in this case. So the statements of Tim are not to be used against Unger, for example, and although a jury is instructed not to do that, it's pretty hard for lay people to ignore the fact that one person has pointed the finger at the co-accused. Similarly, with respect to Unger and what he said.
Dangerfield has implemented a case that he hopes will convict both Houlihan and Unger. Aware of the challenges, Kyle Unger's defense lawyer adapts his own strategy and puts his client on the stand to testify.
I really liked the idea of going first in this case because I felt that I had the toughest battle that I had to meet. And I wanted to get my story out to the jury, my version of the extraordinary number of inconsistencies between what Kyle Unger had said in his statements to the police and the physical evidence at the scene. He was just boasting and bragging and trying to play a role as they were to have them believe he was, quote, the kind of guy that they were looking for in this little criminal organization.
All the efforts of Sheldon Pinks are directed toward influencing how the jury will perceive Kyle Unger's confession, recorded by the undercover agents.
I still remember some of the language that he used, and it was horrific. I mean, what he said, he did to her, in particular with the use of the sticks. And he was so graphic, and he was sort of like almost jumping around like an excited kid as he described in horrific language what he had done. Even though I still had doubts as to his guilt, because I truly believed that he hadn't done it. I felt that it's going to be so hard for a jury to understand that even an innocent person can speak the way Kyle Unger did.
The devastating effect of the recorded confession does nothing to help Unger's defense, and the jury won't get to hear Tim Houlihan's version of the crime.
Brenda Kaiser, Tim Houlihan's lawyer, didn't put him on the stand, and the jury heard from Kyle what his story was. The jury never heard from Tim.
On other fronts, Sheldon Pinks has some success. Dr. Sperber, an internationally renowned American odontologist, testifies. He tells the court about his comparative analysis of the bite marks found on the body of the victim and the teeth imprints given by Kyle Unger.
The field is called forensic odontology, and he did an amazing job explaining why he concluded it was not Kyle Unger's, which leaves me to the obvious question, which is, it had to be Houlihan's. Who else is going to be it under the circumstances?
On advice of his counsel, Houlihan refuses to give a dental imprint. The bite mark evidence is inconclusive. Kyle Unger's defense undermines the evidence that led to the undercover operation, the statement from the Remand Center informant, Jeffrey Cohen.
And that's where I picked up the ball, so to speak, and seemed to by fluke recall that when Cohen claimed that Unger had returned to his jail cell at the Remand Center, I seem to recall footage from one of our TV stations where he actually walked out of the court building at 408 York Avenue and never returned to the Remand Center. I got that footage, which confirmed he never was released from the Winnipeg Remand Center. He walked straight out of the court building at 408 York. I then subpoenaed the records from the Winnipeg Remand Center, and we established through their records he never came back. They have him moving over to 408 York. They have no record of him coming back in. So, I mean, it was beyond a shadow of a doubt proven this guy just simply fabricated the story. And my theory was for the consideration and getting a break on his charges.
The expert testimony of a hair analyst doesn't go in Kyle Unger's favor. A hair that was found on Brigitte Grenier's sweater matched a sample provided by Unger.
But as you can appreciate, the microscopic examination would be limited to color, coarseness, I guess, thickness. You're talking about a visual comparison, which would really be totally dependent on the subjective opinion of your analyst. We used to call this junk science, many of the defense lawyers, because all that they should be able to say at best is it's consistent with perhaps Mr. Unger's hair. So the hair evidence, if it were properly presented to the jury, should not in those days have been given as much weight.
A simple question from Tim Houlihan's defense will suddenly shed new light on the result of the hair comparison.
But in this particular case, I recall the expert adding a couple of things, and one came out in cross-examination, which was Ms. Kaiser asked the expert in cross-examination, can you provide us with a probability as to how frequent or not this particular hair would be either Unger's or somebody else's? And she says, well, it would be 1 in 4,500. So in other words, in 1 in 4,500 other people, we may find this particular hair. That's a lot different than just simply saying it's consistent with. You're now creating, I think, a more substantial opinion.
This hair plays a key role in the case because it's the only physical evidence that ties Kyle Unger to the crime.
There were a couple of hairs that were found to be consistent with Tim on her clothing, but those were really a non-issue given that he had admitted having contact with her.
In his closing arguments, Sheldon Pinks proclaims with confidence that Kyle Unger has never had a motive for the murder.
Kyle Unger says he didn't know Tim Houlihan. They weren't friends. What then would have been Kyle Unger's motive to, even if he did accidentally see them together in the bush? And what would have prompted him to go snooping around? We didn't see any evidence of him stalking her or bothering her where people had to intervene. There's nothing whatsoever that can be said to attribute a motive to Kyle Unger to have been involved.
In his final argument, Pinks adds that if there is a guilty party, it is Tim Houlihan. Houlihan was the last person to see the victim alive. Witnesses saw him covered in mud, scratches, and blood after the crime. He refused to provide dental imprints or hair samples and did not testify at the trial. Pinks concludes that the only one who could have murdered Brigitte Grenier is Tim Houlihan. The verdict is announced. Unger and Houlihan are both convicted of first-degree murder.
And as part of that, that means you're in prison for the rest of your life, and you might have a chance of getting parole after 25 years, but it's a lifetime in jail unless a parole board lets you out after 25 years.
At the end of this trial, Tim Houlihan and Kyle Unger are incarcerated. But without a motive or any conclusive evidence, both defendants decide to appeal their verdicts. Will they be freed? On February 28, 1992, Kyle Unger and Tim Houlihan are sentenced to 25 years in prison for the murder of 16-year-old Brigitte Grenier. Immediately, the lawyers for both convicted men prepare their appeals. Sheldon Pinks presents his argument for Kyle Unger.
We argued that the verdict was not a reasonable verdict. It couldn't be supported by the evidence. We pointed to all of the inconsistencies, the physical evidence, and many of the inconsistencies between the physical evidence and Kyle Unger's reported confession, to say it was blatantly unreliable, it was laced with inducements, and that certainly it should not rise to the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But unfortunately, all of the arguments that were advanced were not viewed favorably by the Court of Appeal, and his appeal was dismissed.
Brenda Kaiser has more success with Houlihan's appeal.
There were a number of grounds of appeal. They involved the inflammatory address by counsel for the co-accused. I believe the failure to sever when that had been requested. Tim was released at some point before his appeal was heard. He went back to live with his parents in Sperling, Manitoba, and was working at a local machinery shop in Sperling.
The Manitoba Court of Appeal orders a new trial for Tim Houlihan, but on July 20th, 1994, he commits suicide. Houlihan is taken to a Winnipeg hospital where he dies at 9:15 p.m.
In retrospect, obviously the stress of being out on bail with a first-degree murder charge hanging over your head, having also already spent some time in a federal prison awaiting the appeal, that would have been very, very stressful. So in retrospect, it's not all that surprising.
But it just looks suspicious. Then all of a sudden you have somebody who had just been granted a new trial to show the world that, yeah, they're innocent. But then you have a suicide, and that makes you wonder in terms of, well, so if that didn't make him happy that he was getting a new trial, why would that be? And one of the conclusions that can be raised is that he committed the homicide.
For nearly 10 years, Kyle Unger proclaims his innocence while serving his sentence in a British Columbia prison. In 2003, the Manitoba justice system re-examined many murder convictions that involved hair analysis. Kyle Unger's case is among them. The hair samples, along with a sample of Kyle Unger's DNA, are sent to a lab in the United States for profiling. James Lockyer, a lawyer specializing in wrongful convictions, offers to take on Kyle Unger's appeal. On September 15, 2004, the results of the comparison are released. The hair found on Brigitte Grenier's sweater does not belong to Kyle Unger. Lockyer now sets out to prove that Unger made a false confession to the undercover operators. He turns to Dr. Gisli Gudjonsson, the world's foremost authority on false confessions. Dr. Gudjonsson interviews Unger and notes that he lacks detailed knowledge about the murder, very specific information that only the killer would know. Gudjonsson concludes, it is not recommended to rely on the confessions obtained from Mr. Unger during the undercover operation. Lockyer also discovers that the informant, Jeffrey Cohen, asked to be paid for his confession. This should have made his testimony inadmissible at trial. The more Lockyer researches, the more he finds that an alarming amount of information was not disclosed to defense counsel before the trial.
Disclosure has completely changed from over 20 years ago to today. Today you would have a complete file. You would have access as counsel to anything that could potentially be helpful to your case. Whether it was helpful to your accused directly, or whether it was something that perhaps was negative about a co-accused that could be indirectly helpful, you would have access to all of that information. That it was not that readily available over 20 years ago. And there was a less of an expectation that it would be provided fully.
While reviewing the police interview transcripts, Lockyer discovered that in the early days of the investigation, the police favored the theory that the murder was committed by two people.
You know, his first interview tells the story about how he was in the bush and doing things with Grenier, and along comes this person. But in statement number one, he didn't know who it was. Didn't know. Told the police officer, I don't know who that person was. And magically, in statement number two, the same person, after perhaps some interesting questions that were posed to him in a arguably leading manner, he then comes forward with, oh yeah, it was Kyle Unger suddenly.
The most shocking piece of undisclosed information is Tim Houlihan's alleged involvement in satanic rituals.
None of that came out during the trial. The Crown never brought any evidence on that, because to hear about if there'd been any question that Tim Houlihan was involved with satanic tendencies and that may have led to Brigitte's death or during her death, we would have wrote about it. We would have published it. But as I say, we didn't hear about that.
The Satanistic issues dealing with Mr. Houlihan could have led us to make other inquiries with respect to Houlihan, possibly hiring a private investigator to see what we could find and to see whether he was associated with a particular cult out there.
If Tim Houlihan's belief in Satan is true, it would shed new light on the question of a possible motive in the murder of Brigitte Grenier, and it could explain the gruesome nature of the crime.
I'm 100% convinced Kyle Unger was and is innocent of this crime. I have no doubt in my mind that it was Tim Houlihan who committed this crime.
We may never know who really killed Brigitte Grenier. Kyle Unger was exonerated by the court and was released after 14 years in prison. Tim Houlihan took his secret to the grave by committing suicide. The waters of Pumpkin Creek may have washed away crucial evidence in this vile murder. What we do know is that no water can wash away the memory of Brigitte Grenier. On the surface, Edmonton, Alberta is a quaint, prosperous city, crossed by the deep valley and murky waters of the North Saskatchewan River. If you look a little deeper, you will see a most sinister crime. In a quiet residential neighborhood, you will find a husband, father, and so-called filmmaker who brings his horror movie to life. This case begins with the suspicious disappearance of John Altinger, a sociable 38-year-old who was well-liked by everyone.
It wasn't a person who was involved in anything bad, it seemed. No, John Altinger was just your seemingly normal, everyday individual. He went to work, he came home, and now he was missing.
Altinger's friends are worried that they haven't heard from him. They notify the police on October 17, 2008. In less than a week, the missing person investigation stalls. The file lands on the desk of Detective Bill Clark, a veteran of the homicide squad.
They had received some emails that indicated Johnny had run away with a woman to Costa Rica, and they were wondering because every time they got an email, they would reply and they would never get a reply back from Johnny. And a whole pile of his friends got this email. The friends had gone to his apartment and found that his passport was still there and his suitcases were there. So a passport, very unusual because you're obviously not going to get into these other countries anymore without a passport, you know, even back in 2008. But the other thing was his red Mazda was missing. Things weren't looking good. I mean, nothing obvious. And the one other big thing they had was they had received an email and it gave directions to a garage about how he was going to meet a woman named Jen.
Could the woman that John Altinger was supposed to meet at the garage be the same woman he went to Costa Rica with?
So they had followed the directions. They found the garage. The garage was in a South Side neighborhood, middle class, residential neighborhood, nothing unusual about the neighborhood. They went to the garage and the garage was locked up.
The police find out that a man named Mark Twitchell is renting the garage. He agrees to meet them and give them access.
And he tells them about why he rented the garage. And he describes himself as an up-and-coming filmmaker. He had a film crew and equipment, and they had used the garage and done some filming there in September. And he indicated several times to the officers what type of film he was filming, a film about a guy that he called it House of Cards. And the guy was lured to the garage and ultimately killed in the garage. It was an internet luring thing.
Twitchell says the lock on the garage door has been changed and he does not have a key. With his permission, police cut the lock and enter the garage.
You can basically find nothing. It's just an empty garage. There was a table in there, a chair, there was, you know, some shelves with different type of supplies on, lots of cleaning supplies in there. And these were all things that Mark Twitchell, standing at the door, looked in and said, yeah, that's all my stuff.
The police officer asked Mark Twitchell if he has seen or knows John Altinger and if he noticed a red car. Twitchell answers no, without hesitation. The officer then asked Twitchell about a receipt he found in the garage. It was from a hardware store for a lock purchased with a credit card dated a few days earlier.
And we were able to prove where he bought that lock, and we got the receipt and everything, so.
Twitchell is forced to admit that it's his card and apologizes for his poor memory. Caught in a lie, the police take advantage of Twitchell's cooperative attitude and ask him to make a statement at the police station. As a precaution, the police put the garage under surveillance and prohibit anyone from accessing it. Detective Bill Clark reviews the notes from Twitchell's interview. He is looking for anything that might link Twitchell with John Altinger's disappearance.
I remember thinking to myself, going, oh, this Mark Twitchell guy interviewed really well. Like, he's really forward, and he answered all the questions. He had logical answers to those questions. There was no obvious signs of deception I noted in that interview.
Meanwhile, United States Customs confirmed that Altinger did not enter U.S. airspace, which means he did not fly to Costa Rica. Investigators now suspect that John Altinger has met with foul play. Detective Clark and his colleague, Detective Mark Anstey, split up the work. Clark will do the field work and Anstey will do the paperwork. The next step is to search Altinger's apartment.
We sent our IDENT team, or our crime scenes examination team, to Johnny's apartment. Obviously, first step, let's send the experts in, looking for signs of a struggle, signs of blood, any signs of foul play. So that's where we start with. Johnny's apartment, we don't need a search warrant, so we just simply go in, we start doing our examination. Understanding that his friends had broken in. They don't find anything unusual. The same thing the friends found. They find the suitcases, they find the passport, they dirty dishes. The place isn't filthy, but it's unkept. They do find the printer missing, and his friend said he had a laptop, which was missing.
Investigators request a search warrant for the garage that Twitchell rents, but the judge denies it.
We could not prove that anything had happened to John. Other than he was missing, we couldn't say he was harmed, kidnapped, murdered. We didn't know. So we could not. You need a criminal offense to get a search warrant.
Detective Bill Clark then decides to ask Twitchell to sign a consent form to search the garage. He calls Twitchell at his home in St. Albert, north of Edmonton. Twitchell agrees to sign. Clark organizes a meeting between him and Detective Brian Murphy. Mark Twitchell is very cooperative. He signs the consent form and then volunteers some very surprising information to Murphy.
Well, within 30 minutes, the whole case turns on its head.
While Twitchell goes back to his car to retrieve the new keys to the garage door, Detective Murphy phones the office.
We're sitting there and Brian calls and he says, "You won't believe it. Mark Twitchell just told me he bought a red car off a guy." So we asked Brian, we got a code for "Are you alone?" And he sends back the code that "No, I'm not alone." So we tell Brian, keep talking to him, don't let him go anywhere.
The coincidence is surprising. Altinger's missing car is red, and so is the car Twitchell just bought. Twitchell is now a suspect and must be handled with caution.
Obviously now, we don't want to start questioning the car. We want him on tape, so everything we do is recorded and up front, read again, preparing it for court. So we tell him, come down to the front police station, and Detective Clark will meet you at the front, and we'll do an interview and then get you on your way. Just cover off the red car. Mark's Mr. Cooperative. Twitchell, he just, no problem, I'll do it.
Bill Clark is about to meet a suspect in person for the first time. Will this interview give him insight into what happened to John Altinger? Is Mark Twitchell involved in some way? On Friday, October 10th, 2008, John Altinger sends a strange email to his friends saying he went to Costa Rica with the woman of his dreams. But his friends are suspicious and alert the police. The missing person trail leads to the so-called filmmaker Mark Twitchell. He admits to buying a red car from a stranger, which could be Altinger. Detective Bill Clark invites Twitchell to the police station for an interview.
I meet him at the front, first time I met him. Shake his hand, seems like a nice guy. Nothing unusual about him. We just walk into what we call a soft interview room. And I know it's being recorded. I don't tell people it's being recorded. I'm sure he knew that or may have thought about that. I asked Mark Twitchell, can you write out a statement about what you forgot to tell us? Why don't you just start from when you rented the garage, tell me about your movies, tell me everything all the way till tonight. As far back as it takes, you take as long as you want. So I give him a whole pile of witness statement forms and a pen, and he starts writing.
While detectives Bill Clark and Mark Anstey wait in the observation room, Twitchell writes, page after page.
He writes for over 2 hours, which is unbelievable. I've never had that happen on anybody. So in 8 pages, I have about 6 pages of start in Mark Twitchell, as I describe it, telling me all about his movie business and how great he is and all this filming he's doing. He's supposed to tell me about this red car and how this all came about. I have about 2 paragraphs on the red car, very slim. What he wrote in the written statement about the red car was basically that he's at a gas station, he gets gas, and he parks on the side of the road because he gets a phone call. And a guy comes up to his car and says, knocks on his window and says, yeah, do you want to buy a red car off me for $40? It's his written statement. So I'm thinking, come on, this doesn't make sense.
Then Twitchell tells Bill Clark the story in full detail for 2 hours without interruption.
And interesting enough, he describes a guy that looks much like Johnny. You know, this white guy, and he's about 6 feet tall, and he's got the brown hair, and he told me he was running off with his sugar mama, and he wanted to sell his car, and it was right over there in the parking lot.
Twitchell says he asked the guy with the Mazda to drive it to the rented garage. Then Twitchell gave him $40 without drawing up a sales receipt.
That's it. I said, oh, okay. And he says, yeah, and I'm really sorry I didn't tell you guys about the red car. I said, well, you know, it slipped your mind, not a big deal. The whole time I'm thinking, yeah, right. But I go with it.
It's nearly 3 a.m., and Twitchell's story continues. He explains that he called his friend Josh to drive the Mazda because he can't drive manual transmission. Mark Anstey is monitoring the interview. He notes the address Twitchell gives for his friend and immediately sends an officer to look for the car.
So after the question and answer, I take a break. Mark and I have been getting along good, talking up front, very good. I go out and I go, man, this guy is involved up to his neck. I talk to the Detective Anstey and Detective Murphy. They tell me, yeah, we got the red car. We're at Josh's house now. We got officers there. They found the red car. It's on the driveway. I says, okay, good. We got to seize that.
Bill Clark returns to the interrogation room and changes his approach.
I love being the bad cop. This good cop stuff is really tough for me at times to hold it in. I'm like an actor out there going, oh, Twitchell, you're so full of crap, you know, but I'm putting on the straight face, playing, I'm just a dumb cop. You know, Mark, I could really see in the few hours I interviewed him, he thought he was smart. And he thought he was smarter than me, so that worked to my advantage. I'll play with that.
The interview becomes a battle of the minds between Detective Bill Clark and Mark Twitchell.
Because I know where the camera is. I didn't want to block the view because we want to catch his facial expression. We want to catch his body language. And I said, just so you know, again, you want to call a lawyer anytime you can. I say, Mark, I know you're involved in the disappearance of Johnny Altinger. And I don't say anything. Well, there's a 13-second pregnant pause, I call it, where he says nothing. He is like a deer in the headlights. And then Mark goes, whoa, 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 why? And I'm thinking, oh my, what a response that is. Like, you are guilty of something here, buddy. So I sit down after he stumbles with the why, and that's the first time he's really uncomfortable. Well, he just starts to clam up now. Very non-talkative, very pulled back now, sitting back. And at times, you know, he crosses his arms. At times, he's just uncomfortable. Never asked to leave, and I don't offer. I keep talking. Problem is, within 15 minutes, I'm done. I have nothing else to tell him that I know. I says, at one point, I says, you know, you're not going to be able to live with yourself with what you've done. I'm alluding to the fact that he's killed John without saying it. And he makes a comment to me, and he says, you'd be surprised what I can live with.
What did this short comment really mean? Has Twitchell said too much? But Clark chooses not to pursue it. By 6 a.m., they have reached a stalemate. Bill Clark still doesn't have reasonable cause to hold Twitchell, and then he asks to speak to his lawyer. Meanwhile, the investigators fear that Twitchell might try to destroy evidence. They request a warrant to put him under surveillance. When Twitchell's interview is finished, Detective Clark escorts him to his car, where he intends to play his next card.
We get down to the front, and I says, I'm taking your car. And he turns around, he goes, what? I says, I'm taking your car, I'm seizing your car. She turned and was shocked that I was taking his car. And I said, yeah, you told me the keys and license plate were in there, so I'm gonna get a search warrant and seize those items. And he says, well, I just need to get a couple of things out of it. I said, you're getting nothing out of that car. Nothing. So he hands me the keys. And I says to him then, I says, I know you killed him. I'm coming for you, it's just a matter of time. And he just looked at me and turned and walked away. I watched him walk down the street. Mark, as we know, did not go back to his house in St. Albert. He ended up staying at his parents' house in Edmonton, in the North End neighborhood. And by the next day, we had surveillance on that residence, and we're watching Mark Twitchell.
On October 21st, the search of Twitchell's car begins to reveal many surprises.
Well, the search warrant for Mark Twitchell's car was an absolute gold mine. And he had a map, a hand-drawn map on a yellow sticky that led from the garage to Johnny Altinger's apartment on Ellerslie Road. I mean, that's a huge piece of evidence. Why would you have that? He had stickers on there about, actually, that said, he's going to have sex with his girlfriend. You know, just crazy evidence. They found a laptop computer in that car. You can seize items, but that doesn't give you the right to examine the contents of those items. But now you need a second warrant to search them because you're really invading their privacy then. So we got a second warrant to search the contents of the computer. They found a knife in the car with visible blood on it to the human eye. Pull up the trunk, there looks to be a red blood stain in the trunk. So this was huge. Now you gotta also realize in the meantime, we're also examining the red car belonging to Johnny Altinger. There is what appears to be red blood in the trunk of Johnny's car too.
Investigators work to create a DNA profile from the evidence gathered from Altinger's apartment.
And you know, it's not like CSI on TV. Basically, they take it to the lab and about 30 minutes later, they got a DNA profile and they know who the bad guy is. Well, in real life, that doesn't happen. That's not the way it works. DNA, average 60 days to get DNA results. You know, depending on the urgency of your case. If they prioritize it, it takes about, in the fastest time, 5 to 7 days doing everything in 2008. The lab ends up developing a profile of a single male on the blood found in the trunk of the car, but the problem is we do not have our missing man's DNA.
The lab manages to extract Altinger's DNA. They begin the comparison of the two DNA profiles from the cars, which they estimate should take about 10 days. Will they discover that the blood found belongs to John Altinger? And if it is his blood, where is his body? The disappearance of John Altinger launches an unprecedented homicide investigation. Dozens of pieces of evidence are collected, including a knife with traces of blood. Everything points to one primary suspect, the so-called filmmaker Mark Twitchell. But without a body, the police can't arrest or charge Twitchell. Then, a dramatic turn of events occurs.
About the fourth day into our investigation, I'm sitting at my desk and Detective Anstey comes down and says, "You will not believe what we got off the computer." The computer had deleted files that were pulled off of the hard drive by our tech crimes unit, and they pulled up a 30-page diary, which basically detailed what we believed was the entire killing of Johnny Altinger. It was a detailed diary. It was called SK Confessions, the document. We felt the title meant Serial Killer Confessions. One of the first lines on the document was, in the first few paragraphs was, "I'm not sure when I decided to become a serial killer, but it was a feeling of pure euphoria." Now it was our job to prove that document was true.
Twitchell calls himself a filmmaker, and the SK Confessions reads like a movie script. Investigators need to establish whether it is fact or fiction.
So what Detective Anstey did was he basically went line by line through this 30-page document and pulled out all the facts as written by Mark Twitchell. And anytime he had a fact, we assigned that as a task to a detective. So there was some, I forget how many there were, it was over 300 points that we felt we could prove or disprove in this document. And detectives were assigned all these tasks to do.
The SK Confessions provide the investigators with a possible hypothesis for the sequence of events. The narrator in the script describes how he went about attracting his prey. Bill Clark believes the narrator is Twitchell himself.
Mark Twitchell sets up the Plenty of Fish website on that Friday morning of October the 10th at about 10 o'clock in the morning. He sets up the profile for this Jen character, the blonde girl on the site. Basically, the site is You know, it's alluding to having sex, a weekend of sexual activities, you know, typical movie stuff. His goal was to lure a single man. His mentality was a single man will not be missed as much. And the one he keyed on was John Altinger, because he matched everything he wanted. The single male, was free for the whole weekend. So he made arrangements during that afternoon to meet with John, and he gives him the directions to the garage. So they arrange a time to meet. John's so excited to meet this girl, he drives over and gets there early. And he actually doesn't realize it, but he walks into the garage, the lights are on, the door's half open, and he runs into Mark Twitchell. And Mark describes it in his SK Confessions document. And Mark is an actor and a half. I'm sorry, I'm supposed to meet a girl here. Oh yeah, you must need Jen. Yeah, she just went out for a while. She'll be back in a bit. Oh, and he plays it up that, oh, I'm supposed to meet her, but I'm a little early. And Mark says to him, well, yeah, you can come back. So Johnny leaves.
A few minutes later, Johnny receives an email from Jen, who reschedules their rendezvous.
So Mark describes in his SK Confessions document how now he's wondering, okay, do I carry through? He's now having almost second thoughts. Do I carry through with it or not? Do I go? And then he decides, yeah, I'm gonna carry through with it. So John comes back that Friday night, and when he gets there, the door is halfway up, and it's dark now in the garage. And boom, as described in the SK Confessions document, he gets multiple blows over the back of his head with these lead pipes. Mark Twitchell describes it as a tough time for John to go down. And John gets back up again and tries to fight him. But he's so groggy from the blows to the head that Mark Twitchell then describes how he takes out his hunting knife and he says, I plunged it into his gut and it was pure Hollywood. I remember those words, reading those words. It was pure Hollywood, the way John's eyes just bulged and he felt that knife go into him. And he says, I just held it there and he died right in my arms. He then doesn't know what he's gonna do. She goes home in the blood-soaked clothes. He leaves John on the floor of the garage that night, locks the garage up. Pretty bold, like you don't think, you know, you just killed someone, not worried about getting rid of him, and goes home.
In the SK Confessions, the narrator says he returned home around midnight and sneaks into the basement. His wife is asleep upstairs and does not notice. He throws his clothes in the washing machine and goes to bed.
He then goes back the next day is Saturday and he starts his cleanup. So he places John up on the table and he starts cutting him up with the game processing kit. And he talks about humming a song, singing a song, eating potato chips, having a drink of pop while he's doing it, like he's actually enjoying himself. He thinks this is great. He talks in detail about how he's slicing in and how easily the flesh is splitting and how easy it is to cut along the joints, to sever the bones into smaller pieces. And he describes putting him into a green garbage bag. And his whole thing is then he's gonna throw him into some body of water somewhere and get rid of him.
The SK Confessions document goes on to describe the disposal of the victim's body.
So he packed John's remains into the trunk of John's car, the red Mazda. This is when he realizes, oh, the standard, I can't drive it. Shoot, I can't. I'm gonna have trouble with this car. He takes the bags out. Of course, some has dripped out. The blood's in the trunk. And he moves into his car. So now he has him in his car, and he now drives around for several days with him in his car. He's not sure where to dump him, and he checks out river sites, and for various reasons decides not to dump him in the river, and then comes back and decides it'll be the barrel, the burn barrel. So he takes the barrel and ends up at his mother's house during a weekday in the following week and tries to burn John's remains. And he thought you could burn a body in a 45-gallon drum barrel because that's been seen on many shows. In reality, it takes a lot of heat and that to burn a body. So he's burning this body parts in his barrel. He heard a fire truck siren, and he thought they were coming to his fire. That the neighbor saw the smoke coming out of the barrel and called. So he quickly dumps the barrel out, puts the fire out, and drags with the remnants of the plastic and the body parts and throw them in his parents' garage, expecting fire department to arrive.
But the firefighters don't arrive. They were dispatched to another fire a few blocks away.
And what was frustrating was the document, the 30-page diary or whatever it was, ended before it said where he dumped the body. And the script went all funny on the page, and it was where they were pulling it off the deleted file. And we kept going to him, you gotta find more. There's only a few more pages to this, and he's gonna describe where he dumped the body.
The SK confessions lead investigators to suspect that Twitchell used Altinger's internet accounts to send forged emails to his friends so they would believe he was still alive. But Twitchell's writing obviously wasn't good enough to convince them. Can forensics recover the last pages of the SK confessions and reveal where the body was dumped? Will the DNA results confirm the blood in the car is John Altinger's? In Edmonton, police are accumulating an impressive number of exhibits in the John Altinger case. The suspect, Mark Twitchell, has written what seems to be a detailed diary of the murder. However, the body of the victim is nowhere to be found. Police wait impatiently for confirmation that the blood found at the scene of the crime is that of John Altinger. They also hope that forensic experts can successfully extract the missing pages of the SK confession from Twitchell's computer. At Mark Twitchell's home in St. Albert, the forensic team finds drops of blood on the washing machine, on his belt buckle, and on a pair of jeans. They easily discover a painted hockey mask that is the exact match for the one described by the murderer in the SK confessions. The garage that Twitchell rented is a wealth of evidence. There is little doubt that this is the crime scene. Forensic technicians spray luminol to test for blood. The entire garage begins to glow under the black light.
When you first walk in and look, you wouldn't notice it. It's really tough to see. You need to really get your light down and take a good look and know what you're looking for.
This type of blood spatter is well known among specialists. Annie Sauvageau, a forensic pathologist, describes how it is produced.
When someone is hit in the head with a blunt weapon, for example, with a metal bar or a baseball bat, the scalp will open under the impact of the weapon. It's what we call a laceration. After the first impact, there won't be bleeding yet, and won't be any blood spatter either. But after the first shot, the scalp that just opened is going to bleed, and the scalp and hair will be soaked with blood. And the second shot, and the following shots at the moment when the weapon hits the head, blood will splash from all the blood that's collected like a sponge by the hair and the wound.
And he was able to determine from the blood spatter the height of the blows, how many blows, different blows there could have been, that type of thing.
The evidence once again matches the SK confessions. Twitchell writes that the killer uses metal pipes because it was more effective than a stun gun.
The pipes were also found in the garage. They had, the one pipe had John's blood on the end of it. It was a threaded pipe, and there was actually, you could see to the naked eye, brain matter inside the end of the pipe. It was an open-ended pipe. There was a green case which had a game processing kit in it, which is for processing big game. As a hunter, you shoot a moose in the bush, you go out and you chop it up. You open the kit, every single tool, I don't know how many are in there, 6 or 8, had blood on it. That's what he used to carve up Johnny. So off to the side, the 45-gallon drum barrel was next to the table, and it had the burn marks on the drum barrel from stuff being burned in it. There was a lot of cleaning supplies in there. There was rubber gloves, there was sheets of plastic, there was different, I don't know if it was bleach or what it was, but some, cleaning supplies like that. Paper towels, things of that nature.
Finally, the experts in the computer forensics unit are able to rebuild the final pages of the SK confessions.
Get about another 4 pages. And those 4 pages now describe that he's dumped the body in a sewer in a suburb of Edmonton.
The exploration of the city's sewer system begins. It's an immense undertaking. The forensic examination of Twitchell's computer is now complete. But investigators were hoping to discover one last piece of evidence.
We thought from the start that Mark Twitchell had filmed the murder. We thought that was his motive, that there was a snuff film basically made on the murder of Johnny, and we were going to find that on a hard drive. When we got the written document, though, there was no indication in the written document that he had filmed it. It was just his plan and his excitement about becoming a serial killer.
Since his interview with Detective Clark, Mark Twitchell has been hiding in his parents' house. He communicates with the outside world primarily through the internet.
And during that time, we started a undercover operation where we started contacting Mark Twitchell on the internet. Because one of the things we learned during that next week, as the investigation progressed, was that Mark Twitchell had bilked several of his friends out of thousands of dollars. He had convinced his friends and several associates that he had a $3.5 million trailer-type film he was going to make. We know of 3 people that invested $35,000, and Mark lived off that money. He had a website, I believe it was called Express, with an X, Express Entertainment. And we went on that website and pretended we were going to be investing with it. And one of the reasons we did that, we were worried based on the document that he had written that he wanted to be a serial killer and he could potentially go out and kill someone else while we're still gathering the evidence to charge him.
Investigators finally get DNA results that link the blood found in Mark Twitchell's car and rented garage to John Altinger.
Everyone's pumped. It's done, the rest day, it's time to haul his butt in. So we go on the internet and we have our undercover operator arrange to meet him at a coffee shop in the neighborhood of his parents' house. So Mark walks out of his house and he gets taken down, and the tactical guys are in a big van, and they just hop out. They got their balaclavas on, their submachine guns, and they're all over him. He's so scared he urinates in his pants. He pisses himself. He's so scared.
Police hold Twitchell in custody before they transfer him to the remand center. Investigators use this time to convince Twitchell to confess where he dumped the victim's body parts. For 8 hours, Bill Clark presents Twitchell with an overwhelming list of all the evidence gathered against him. But Twitchell says nothing. The prosecutor finally brings Twitchell before a judge. He is accused of the first-degree murder of John Altinger and is put in custody. As they prepare the case for trial, the detectives decide to search for another potential victim mentioned in the SK confessions. They send police door to door and make an appeal through the media showing the goalie mask.
That afternoon, I got a phone call from a guy who says, I think this is one of my employees. He told me about it. I says, okay, who is it? He says, his name's Gilles Tetreault. I says, you need to have Gilles contact me. I need to talk to him. And Gilles did, and he came in the next day. It was, without a doubt, the most riveting witness interview I've ever done in my career as a police officer.
7 days before murdering John Altinger, Twitchell made a failed attempt on another victim. Gilles Tetreault was also lured through the online dating site Plenty of Fish.
Gilles gets to the garage, and he crawls underneath the door, and it's dark. And he says, I remember thinking to myself, ooh, this is a little odd. But he's so pumped up about meeting this supposed great-looking blonde girl that he's gonna walk through the garage. And then he sees this guy standing in front of him with this hockey mask. And, you know, he's scared. He's scared beyond belief.
Twitchell attacks Tetreault with a stun gun and forces him to the ground. Tetreault fights back as Twitchell tries to immobilize him. Tetreault sees his life flash before his eyes and fights back with every ounce of strength. He manages to break free and escape. When the attack occurred, Gilles Tetreault was not willing to inform the police. Mark Twitchell is now in custody where he stays quiet. With the overwhelming evidence against him, the court decides to bypass the preliminary hearing and go directly to trial. It is scheduled for March 2011. The SK confessions say that John Altinger's remains were dumped into a sewer. But where in Edmonton's 5,500 kilometers of sewers could they be exactly? Mark Twitchell lures John Altinger to a garage in South Edmonton and murders him. He drew inspiration from the fictional TV serial killer Dexter, who was famous for dismembering his victims and dumping their remains in water. A document found by the police describes the murder in detail. The police can only search a few of the thousands of kilometers of sewers below the city of Edmonton. Mark Twitchell shuts down after his arrest and refuses to reveal where he dumped the remains.
We still didn't have John. We couldn't bring closure to the family. About 2 weeks after his arrest, I went to the Remand Center and we visited Mark Twitchell, simply to try to find the location of the body. He was mad. He says, you guys just don't get it, do you? You know, stuff like that, comments like that.
Detective Bill Clark is not so easily discouraged. He visits Twitchell regularly to try to find out where the body was dumped.
I always thought this was a good comment. He just says, you know, Mark, you have no mitigating circumstances going in your favor. The only thing mitigating for you would be to give us the body back, give us the victim. That's the only thing that might look good for you in court. So we now go another year. It's June, I believe, of 2010. Out of the blue, we get a phone call to our office from Mark Twitchell's lawyer stating that Mark wants to give us something. And I went, oh, he wants to give us the body. It's the only thing we don't have. I couldn't believe it. It was just like out of the blue, almost 2 years later.
Mark Twitchell's lawyer then gives a printed map to police. Twitchell had marked it with the location of Altinger's remains, which was near his parents' home. Ironically, this was just outside the extensive area that was originally searched by investigators.
We ended up going there that night, and we pulled the man cover off, and it was just like he described. And we could see what looked like body parts in the bottom. Tough to tell. Take your flashlight and have a look. So we called the crime scenes unit. Of course, they set the van up, and they're there for 2 days going through that.
When the search is complete, very few of the body parts are recovered. They are in an advanced state of decomposition, which is characteristic of remains that have spent years in water.
Adipocere will occur in an environment that's very humid, for example, in marshes or sewers. At the moment the body is exposed to a very fluid, very watery environment, you'll have a chemical transformation of its fat, which becomes like a large mass of rancid butter. The benefit to the forensic pathologist is that in this state, the body will be better preserved for longer than if it was just in a field exposed to the sun, animals, or wind. However, on the other hand, a sewer could also have rats.
Police recovered the victim's torso, pelvis, a few bones, and a tooth. The remainder were probably flushed out of the sewers into the river, but they have enough to identify the remains.
It's still possible to establish DNA from the bone itself, or from the teeth. The teeth are also a very good environment, and they'll preserve DNA for a very, very long time.
The DNA profile proves that the remains belong to John Altinger. Now the investigators are ready to present their evidence at the trial. Not only have they succeeded in recovering the victim's body, but they have also established how the murder was committed. Investigators broke down the SK confessions into nearly 300 statements and set out to prove or disprove each and every one. Bill Clark and his team were very successful.
I mean, this took months to do. But by the end of the investigation, it was something like 86% we were able to prove were true.
The trial opens to a media frenzy. Everyone wants to know more about Mark Twitchell's strange relationship between reality and fantasy, how he lured his victims through social media, the brutality of the murder, and of course, SK Confessions, Twitchell's personal diary of the murder.
Most trials are quite boring because, you know, the Crown has to be very detailed and they have to establish all the facts and, you know, what everyone's doing and, you know, how they found the evidence and everything like that. This case, with the exception of one day, every single day was compelling.
The jury condemns Twitchell to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. Detective Bill Clark is satisfied with the verdict, but cannot hide his concern.
In Canada, as usual, he could be out after 25 years. Can you imagine that guy at 55? Could be out and he'll know all the mistakes he made and his thoughts aren't going to change. But how can you ever let a guy like that with that mindset out of jail?
It is difficult to grasp how a seemingly normal person like Mark Twitchell could commit a murder so gruesome. It seems that Mark Twitchell lived a fantasy life through fictitious characters, such as Dexter Morgan, the TV serial killer who kills other serial killers. But is it right to blame film and television for Twitchell's behavior?
There are millions of people who watch Dexter and similar sort of shows, be it violent shows or things with a vigilante theme. And the vast majority of those individuals don't ruminate about it. They don't obsess about it. They don't have any inclination to bring that sort of fantasy or fictitious element into their real life.
What Dr. Liam Ennis finds troubling in Mark Twitchell's case is that the motive for the murder is simply to kill for the sake of killing, for the pleasure of it.
We're talking about a homicide here that was not committed for money. It was not committed to keep a secret. It was not committed out of some sort of passion or specific revenge against an individual. And that's why you have to think that individuals like that, when that's the motivation for the killing, is those feelings of superiority. You can see why they go back to the drawing board and do it again. They never get a buzz like that or a thrill like that from anywhere else in their lives, nor does the actual commission of the crime ever quite live up to the fantasy.
Twitchell failed with his first attempted murder of Gilles Tétrault, but he was successful the second time with John Altinger. Does that make him a serial killer?
We do believe that we caught him on his first murder, but we also do believe he would have carried on based on the knowledge we learned about Mark Twitchell over the following months.
This crime played out on the thin border between reality and fiction. On the surface, a normal suburban rendezvous between a man and a woman looking for a relationship. And beneath the surface, the monstrosity of a sick mind, the pleasure of killing, and the foul waters of the city's sewers.